Hi, everybody. Today's Wednesday, June 11th, 2025, and our friends Ray McGovern and John Helmer are back with us. Welcome back.
Thanks,
Thank
Nima.
you.
Good to see you, John.
You
Let
too,
me
Ray.
play, to start this talk today, let me play a clip of Tulsi Gabbard emphasizing the importance of nuclear weapons and how devastating those weapons could be in the current situation that we're living in.
Today, closer to the brink of nuclear annihilation than ever before, political elite and warmongers are carelessly fomenting fear and tensions between nuclear powers. Perhaps it's because they are confident that they will have access to nuclear shelters for themselves and for their families that regular people won't have access to. So it's up to us, the people, to speak up and demand an end to this madness. We must reject this path to nuclear war and work toward a world where no one has to live in fear of a nuclear holocaust.
John, when it comes to the way that Tulsi Gabbard was talking about, I assume that she's talking mostly about the conflict in Ukraine and the term, maybe the escalation that they can see within the administration, because it's not just about the United States. Here is what the NATO Secretary General suggested.
Agree with Kyiv that to end this war is going to require additional long-range strikes into Russia to take out its industrial capacity?
Well, to end this war, we need Putin to come to the negotiating table and not with this historian who is now popping up in Istanbul twice and again telling us about the history of Russia and Ukraine from whatever, the 12th century, I don't know what it was. And constantly restating what they stated already in 2022. You need a Russia which is serious, wants to negotiate and end the war. And to get there, it all, I think, starts, of course, with keeping Ukraine strong in the fight.
Yeah, they want to arm Ukraine. They don't want to talk about the history. John Helmer, how can that be possible without knowing the history, without knowing the reactions coming up out of Russia to deal with Russia?
Well, it's impossible. The ex-Dutch Prime Minister, Mr. Rutte, has not distinguished his term in office with anything but Russia hating and war fighting against Russia. What is more interesting, his statements entirely predictable. What's more interesting is the ambiguity in Tulsi Gabbard's statement, which could apply not only to the situation where the Ukrainians with US and British help attacked the Russian triad bombers, but she could be meaning the Israeli threat against Iran. She could be meaning North Korea. She could be meaning India and Pakistan. And each one of those stories is different. Maybe I could answer the question by trying to focus on what the strategic necessity is for Russia to avoid what Ms. Gabbard called nuclear holocaust. Right now, this week, and certainly much more significantly than Rutte's reference to the historian, he forgot to mention Vladimir Medinsky's name, and he represents not Russian history, but the president of Russia and the consensus in Russia. The consensus is that Russia must have escalation control in the war on the Ukrainian battlefield. And that has specific requirements, which we can go back to. They spelled out in the 33 terms of the Russian memorandum presented by Medinsky in Istanbul. But escalation control means that you must be able to deter your enemy from escalating further And deterrence is either achieved by destroying their capacity or by negotiating terms of armistice, terms of agreement. Okay? Now, we have a serious strategic problem, Russia does, with the enemy, in as much as everybody understands the United States was directly and indirectly involved with the British in the attack on the nuclear triad. Now, if and when the proxy nature of that attack is understood to be Russia versus NATO, represented by Rutte, whom you just played, Russia versus the United States, Russia versus the Anglo-American Empire, or the American Empire with the Anglos hanging on the edge of it. We have to we have a system deterrence, nuclear deterrence, balanced nuclear deterrence, mutual assured destruction, in which one side does not attack the other side's capacity to deter, because out of the belief that you can win a nuclear exchange. So with that strategic necessity, Russia has to develop an end of war outcome, and it's spelled out in the 33 terms. On the other hand, Rutte is spelling out that the Allies, including the United States, aim to destroy or threaten to destroy or deter Russia's ability to escalate. So that's how the two sides are now facing each other. And that's why it's so important to understand the nature of the so-called Russian retaliation for the attack on the nuclear bombers. The necessity for Russia to prevent escalation by the Ukrainian or Allied side is obvious. The method for preventing the other side, the Ukrainian side, the Anglo-American side, the NATO side, from escalating, the method is still to be decided and still to be demonstrated. Now, several of your previous interviews and podcasts with colleagues with whom I agree have talked about the options, have talked about the importance of yesterday's Security Council meeting in Moscow. We can get into those details, but it is not yet done that Russia can say we've retaliated. Why? Because retaliation must mean deterrence and destruction of capacity. And the place to think about that from an American point of view is the Doolittle raid on Tokyo, 1942, which was retaliation for Pearl Harbor, or the firebombing of Tokyo, March 1945, which killed larger numbers of people, or the Anglo-American firebombing of Dresden, February of 1945. When you look at what Rutte's relatives, what the NATO predecessors did, what the United States policy was in those engagements, those forms of attacking civilians, was that retaliation? Partly. Was it military? Were there military targets? Not much. Were they attacks on civilians for military purposes? Yes, they were, or they were said at the time to be. But our way of thinking today about what Russia must do for Russia's long-term survival in this strategic war with NATO and the United States, we have to think how the US, the British, the Allies, and the Russians thought at that time.
Go ahead, Wayne.
Okay. I agree with John on almost everything here. What I would point out is that there's been a big controversy about what some of your interviewees have called the Oreshnik moment. In other words, these drone attacks on bomber bases within Russia will require an Oreshnik moment, a big attack by Russia on Ukraine and maybe elsewhere when they find out who is really behind it or who facilitated it. Well, that's not really happened, has it? But there
Not
have been
yet.
people.
Not yet.
Well, okay, yeah, but how long has it been now? June 1st? So what is it? So well, what I'm saying is that, well, not yet. All I would say, John, is that we have more of the same, more intense raids and maybe more drone raids and missile raids against in Ukraine. So what I'm trying to say here is that the Russians had to face up to the fact that they were attacked here and that nuclear bombers were there. And it was a pretty cynical thing because they were sitting ducks because of the treaty, right? And so they had to say, well, how are we going to react? And it's very clear how they have chosen to react. Putin, Ushakov, Lavrov, they've all made a distinction between those attacks on the bomber bases, which they don't mention, and the attacks on the bridges, the sabotage, which they call terrorism. And now we're transitioning into a war against terrorism, not against the United States, because the United States has told us, says Ushakov in the reading of that by the summit, telephone summit, he says, well, the president of the United States reassured us again that he had no foreknowledge of what was going to happen. Now, whether that's true or not, the fact that Ushakov, speaking for the formal Russian readout, says, in effect, we believe that there's no. The next sentence says, and so we're going to keep up high-level attacks, including summitry and so forth. So my point is here that there are bigger realities here. And the biggest reality is that Trump and Tulsi Gabbard want to create a more decent relationship with Russia. That's the overweening background here. So what is Tulsi Gabbard saying in this highly unusual, highly unprecedented, I would say, statement from a national intelligence director? She has no business saying the kinds of things she has in a strict intelligence sense. She's saying, look, there are crazies that are talking about using nukes, like mini nukes or whatever. They're out in Omaha at Stratcom. They're all over the place. Now, here I am in Tokyo, or here I am in Japan, and I'm saying, this happened before. They were crazy, and they used them, for God's sake, Well, we don't want to see that happen, okay? That's crazy. I've told the president that, in effect, she's saying. And, in my view now, Nima and John, this applies just as much to the crazies that would encourage Israel to try to take out the nuclear facilities in Iran as it applies to the people who think like a mini nuke would scare the Russians out of their minds in Ukraine. So what she's saying is, look, there are lots of people talking about the Oreshnik moment. Now we have to be ready for that. We have no Oreshniks, but we do have we have many nukes, and we can use them. So let's make a big deal out of this Oreshnik moment. Now it's been 10 days or whatever it is, and there's no Oreshnik moment. Stephen Walt of Harvard, who is one of the leaders of the realistic school of international affairs. I didn't realize there were others, but there are apparently. So he's a realist. He says the attack, he just did a piece, the attacks out there in the bomber bases have no meaning at all. They don't affect anything. And of course, if you're talking about the outcome of the war in Ukraine, of course they don't. It was a manifestation of the fact that Ukraine is still alive, and it was transparently an attempt, as I said at the outset, to throw a rope throw a tool into the machinery of Istanbul talks that would derail them and put the onus on Russia for derailing them, and maybe provoke Russia, maybe provoke Russia into doing something that would give these crazies, these neocons, an excuse to say, my God, well, we don't have any Rushniks. We got to save Ukraine. Now, Ruta is crazy. Those people are delusional. Let's face it. The coalition of the brain dead is what I call them. These people are chinovniki. They're the bureaucrats that rose to the top through the party. Okay. Now, there's no way that the Europeans can substitute for U.S. support for Ukraine. And that's dissipating. U.S. support is not altogether. They'll keep them going for a little while until there's a deal. But when there's a deal, and when these super ideas of the U.S. and Russia to do a détente or even a rapprochement, where they really kick in, then NATO is going to look even more ridiculous than they do now. Now, the fly in the ointment, of course, is, can Trump prevail over the crazies? And
Well,
I think
look,
that question comes up when Trump sends Tulsi Gabbard, the director of national intelligence, to warn the whole world in Japan. Look, this happened before. These people don't know which end is up. Be aware, we have to face them down. That's my analysis of that kind of thing.
I think we need to sort out several of the points here that Ray's mentioned. First of all, Trump is not divorcing himself or his campaigns to make war from the Europeans. The Europeans are not brain dead. We can go one after the other in each country to show what the politics in England, what the politics in France, what the politics in the Netherlands, what the politics in Poland do to support war against Russia. That's not brain deadness, nor is it craziness. If we have to talk about craziness, we start with Donald Trump. We start with the orders to send 5,000 troops into Los Angeles to make war against the governor of California. We can talk about that a bit later, but all Russians are reading the legal papers and the actions on the ground in Los Angeles to understand the mentality of the President of the United States, who decided to do these things in Camp David on the weekend. And that's read in Russia as an understanding of what sort of behavior, violence, threats, bluff, etc., Donald Trump's capable of in his own country and against Russia and in the rest of the world, against China and so forth. We've talked about the sequencing of wars that Trump intends with his administration to pursue. In that situation, what Gabbard had to say is so ambiguous as to mean that Trump's the peacemaker, which he wants to posture to himself to be. Well, he's not in Los Angeles and he's not in the Ukraine. The Ukraine attack on the bomber triad is not a pinprick. It's not terrorism. Terrorism, as defined in Russia at the moment, is a smokescreen designed to minimize the strategic necessity to reply strategically as is required in Russian nuclear doctrine. Just how little the meaning of terrorism is in current Russian doctrine, you'll find in the Russian memorandum that's been tabled in Istanbul. I'll come back to that in a minute, but there is no doubt, and Ray's picking quotes, cherry picking quotes. Sergei Lavrov said on Monday very clearly the line, the US was directly and indirectly involved in that attack, which meant it had to have thought it out strategically. The Ukrainians were simply the method, the delivery vehicle. Second, Lavrov said, quotes, I'm not aware of how thoroughly the US president is briefed regarding operations which the Ukrainian regime conducts against our country. That's the emperor's good, but his advisors are evil. But Lavrov goes a little further than that. He said that numerous American advisors remain embedded within Ukraine's security services, an established fact. They have not been withdrawn. The military instructors from other nations supplying weapons to the Ukrainian regime operate there, and that's equally factual. That they advise Ukrainian armed forces on strategic operations, facility placement and camouflage. This too we've known, etc., etc. There is no doubt Russians do not trust Trump, but they are prepared to say we need to make peace with him and see how far he will go. Second, there's no doubt that the Russian general staff, the intelligence services, the consensus, and President Putin understand what was attempted against the bomber triad. There's no doubt. You can cherry pick, you can find PR statements, but the terrorism is a smokescreen. Why do I know it's a smokescreen? Because you can find that when you look at the conditions that Russia has set for the settlement of the Ukrainian conflict, and I've got to click up and put it on my screen to find it, you find that, and I can't find it now that I'm looking, you'll find there's no term in the Russian terms of end of war that refers to terrorism. There's none. Instead, there's the Russian word diversioni, which covers sabotage, which covers subversion, which covers attacks against civilians. And the term required for the Ukraine after its army is dismantled and limited, after foreign advisors, foreign bases, foreign weapons are removed from the Ukraine, there are all the other terms. The term that deals with so-called terrorism is a guarantee that the Ukraine will not supply, support, or plan diversioni, attacks on Russia of this type. That's where you see exactly what Russians presently mean for dealing with terrorism. But what happened in the airbase attack on June 1 requires a strategic response. And as I say, going back to the point with which we began, strategic response takes time. Yes, when I first mentioned the Oreshnik moment, I meant that the level of retaliation would have to be new and strategic in character. And we use a new weapon that Russia has demonstrated it has to exemplify that. You could say that the dropping of napalm on Tokyo that kills 100,000 people would be also a kind of new weapon, or the same when the Anglo-American bombers went over Dresden. Firebombing is a special kind of strategic weapon then. But now what we're talking about is the time required to test whether Trump will push the Ukrainian regime to signing on those terms. If Trump doesn't, and the Russian side's prepared to give him time, they're prepared to give him a smoke screen, they're prepared to give him more time than the California governor is going to give him, or the court will decide on Thursday in California whether he can apply that sort of force in his own country, in California. The Russian position is more time to test Trump, to test the smokescreen, fig leaf, the means of allowing Trump and those of his advisors who do not want to have a strategic contest with Russia, at least not now, because they've got other wars in mind. That requires time, and it will not. We've seen that the Security Council met yesterday in Moscow. On the surface, it was about the preservation of traditional values, Russian values. The behind closed doors substance of the meeting, predicted by the sources I've spoken to, repeated by Russian bloggers like Boris Rajin and by some of your guests, Nima, predicted to have a decision on the strategic nature. How long do we give Trump? How long do we maintain the smokescreen? Well, they say, let's watch California. Let's see if he's all bluff, if his violent threats are all bluff. Let's wait. We're not in a hurry. Why aren't we in a hurry? Because we're moving steadily westward along the front on several directions. We don't have to do this quickly. We do not have to fire off a barrage of Oreshniki at this point. But what do we know was really decided at that meeting? Well, I'll ask my sources. What I saw at that meeting was what was shown on the screen. What was shown on the screen was there were no military officers, no command.
Right.
But the defense minister, Belousov, wore a military uniform. It's the first time this year he's ever appeared in that council in a military uniform. Why? He doesn't need, all the others were in suits. Why did he do that? It was a signal that the discussion that was behind closed doors was going to be military and strategic in character, not about terrorism, but about the state that controls terrorism. Now, it's very clear from the terms tabled in Istanbul that the Russian position is, if Ukraine sponsors attacks like Crocus Hall in Moscow, killed more than 100 people, or detonates bridges in Kursk and Belgorod, or attacks nuclear airfields. This isn't terrorism, it's the state. And behind the Ukrainian state lies the United States first, and then the other allies. And they've got other weapons, other possibilities of escalating. We've heard Trump's performance with the 25% chance Führer of Germany, Friedrich Merz. That was a performance which, from the Russian point of view, signaled Trump's readiness to support all of the rearmament of Germany, which is aimed at Russia. We've seen there are many, many more examples from a Russian point of view of Trump's readiness to use violence as a bluff, maybe. We'll see in California how that works out. As an actual attack, yes, it happened. So the Russian position is take time, allow Trump to prove himself, and then we'll see.
Ray, jump in. Yeah.
Yeah, there's a lot to dissect there. Let me just start out by saying that neither of us, any of us, think they have a corner on the truth. What we're dealing with is the evidence such as it is and how we reconstruct it. I'm a fan of media analysis, as I know John is quite adept at as well. And so we look really closely at what the Russian leadership says, and we don't pay much attention to what the underlings say. And I would just ask John rhetorically here, because I'd like to go on for a few more sentences, why it was that Lavrov, in a major speech on Monday, on the 9th, why he said absolutely nothing about retaliation for those strikes on the bomber fleets. You're all about sabotage, all about terrorism. Okay, now what else? Here, strategic response. In my view, there were lots of people talking about and the inevitability of a Russian strong military response to what happened. There was all kind of dissecting Russian nuclear doctrine, saying, "Whoa, it's a nuclear field or a field where some nuclear bombers are. The Russians are. Oh, look at the strategic here in paragraph 3 and 4. It says that that would justify a nuclear strike. So we better be ready to do nuclear too." That, I think, is what prompted Trump to tell Tulsi Gabbard, "Get out there and tell the world what that would mean. Tell them that I don't want a nuclear war." And I truly believe that if we know anything about Trump, we know that he doesn't want to get involved in a nuclear war. As for trust, John, you keep saying that there's no trust, but Putin says that he welcomes the trust that has grown up between Trump and himself, that he believes that Trump is sincere in reaching out to Russia. And as I've said a million times, that's the backdrop against which we have to watch all this. Again, what sticks out in my mind is not so much what the rhetoric has been, but what's lacking. And you know how we do this media analysis. Why is it that Putin, that Lavrov, that Ushakov, who gave the readout from the summit telephone call, why they all neglected to say anything about the strikes on those airfields deep into Russia? It's because they've decided that Trump didn't know about it, or that they prefer to believe Trump didn't know about it, and they're going to get on with these things. They're not going to let it provoke them to take the opprobrium for canceling the talks in Istanbul. They're not going to overreact. So, in my view, the strategic response that you talk of, John, has already been made. They're going to focus on terrorism. They're going to talk about blowing up bridges and killing civilians, and they're going to tell the world, as they have already, that they believe that Trump didn't know anything about it. Those are the operative things. What else here before cherry picking? That's kind of unfair, John. I'm not cherry picking. I'm saying, look, I'm reading what they say, and I'm also aware of what they don't say. And what they've decided to do, all of them, was to switch this onto a terrorism frame and say, we're not going to tolerate any more terrorism. And that kind of lets them escape this whole question that you and so many other analysts are raising about there's got to be a response, to the airfields. Well, they don't mention the airfields. There's some significance in the fact that they don't mention the airfields. They've done a deal with Trump. They want to get on with détente. And, John, I disagree with this. Putin says they trust Trump. Putin says that they think Trump is sincere. My God, after all the betrayals since the coup in Maidan, Putin thinks he can say that? Well, he has said it. He said it about a month ago, 6 weeks ago. So I think there is some trust. I think they want to get on with things, and Lavrov and the rest of them are going to keep cool heads here. The problem is the hotheads, the crazies in the West, like Rutte and like a lot of the neocons in Trump's administration, they want to do, they want to be able to escalate after Russia escalates. And sorry for them, but Russia has decided not to escalate. They have the upper hand. As you say, John, they're winning. Why would they want to escalate?
Go ahead, John. Do you
Well,
have
no,
some-
I think Ray's laid out his positions and laid out his points of disagreement with me, and I've laid out my disagreements with Ray. Politicians, good ones, don't trust anyone. And when President Putin says he believes President Trump to be sincere. He's basically saying what's necessary to be said, and so as to encourage Trump to demonstrate whether he deserves any trust, whether he deserves to be believed, whether he deserves to be understood as a peacemaker. It's simply stringing out perfectly reasonably and sincerely and properly and politically the test on Trump. And it's also intended to encourage, from the Russian point of view, to see how far Trump wants to divide himself from Starmer, Macron, Meloni, the Finnish president Stubb, and so forth. It's a test. It's a test. It's a perfectly reasonable test. It's the way to test whether those individuals are as divided as the press wants to make them appear. I agree entirely with Trump. There is a certain amount of hot-headedness. It's in our line of work, it's called clickbait. It's easier to say a sort of massive retaliation that brings us to World War III is about to happen. You put World War III on the headline of this podcast and you suddenly you attract another 100,000 clicks. Okay, that's our game. It's not more intelligent or more different than Murdoch's tits and bums on page 2 of the London tabloids. It's sensation mongering. It's attracting blood, violence, and that sort of stuff. Yes, that's what hotheads do for a living in the media, particularly. So I don't think Ray and I need to repeat the points on which we differ. What we are looking at is a period of time now in which the Russians have put on the table 33 terms, one of which includes and embraces, as I've just said, the concept of terrorism as a state-sponsored form of warfare. It's there. It's called diversione. It's there, but it's not a smokescreen for military action. And we're in military action right now. So we can talk about what's happening, or we can discuss the way we read the multiple of statements that are being made. The fact that and we don't need to repeat ourselves. I'm sure we don't. We can disagree respectfully, as we do, and in a friendly way, because there are multiple interpretations of the same thing at the same time. That's what serious politics and warfare are about.
Yeah, let me just paraphrase what Senator Daniel Patrick Moynihan said. Everybody's entitled to their own interpretations, well, their own opinions, but not to their own facts, okay? What I've adduced are facts, omissions, which are just as important to analyze as words, okay? And, here are 2 other facts. When Lavrov talked on Monday, he blamed the British. He blamed the Anglo-Saxons. And then he said, well, maybe not the Saxons anymore, okay? And there were Western intelligence involved in all this. But there's some evidence now that the Ukrainians, once they got off the dime, they might have been able to do those airfields all by themselves with the new technology that guides drones. Skilled Doctora has just told Judge Napolitano about that. So what am I saying? New facts, okay? The Lavrov not only blamed the British, but he said, we have on the table a proposal. Actually, we have ourselves observed unilaterally a moratorium on INF forces, that is, intermediate and short-range ballistic missile forces in Europe, okay? Now, you got out of that INF treaty, but we are continuing to observe it. Now you, the West, have this deal between the United States and Germany to put them back in there. And we know what you're going to do. You already have such bases which are nuclear capable in Poland and Romania. Now you're going to do it in Germany? Look, we want an answer to that. We have that on the table. You haven't responded. Will you continue to keep this moratorium, or will you deploy these forces, which you said in a very formal bilateral statement back 2 years ago? The Germans have said they are going to allow nuclear capable forces in Germany again, okay? Again. So, and what did Scholz say at the time? Well, the Americans said they wanted to do this, and so we said, okay. Okay, now this is significant. There is a little move put out by Lavrov saying, look, we think this détente is pretty good, okay? Now you can show us that you believe it to be good by doing something like John Kennedy did, something tangible like a limited partial test ban treaty, something that will show us that you're not going to go back to the tense situation that existed when intermediate nuclear forces were stationed. Don't you remember? We destroyed them in place. It was a unique arms control treaty. There were missiles in place, and we destroyed them over a period of 2 years. And Scott Ritter, whom we all know, was one of those inspectors. So are we going to go back to that? Here's a chance for you to show us that you observe this moratorium. Now, that ball is in Trump's court. What will he do? I don't know, but we have this, it's not really an olive branch. We have a Lavrov saying, look, you could show us tangibly that you're interested in détente by removing this irritant. And do the German people really want to be targets for us again? You know, that thing in mid 1980s, that was really tense in Europe. And as you probably remember, Reagan, calling Russia the evil empire, was persuaded that Gorbachev was honest and could be trusted with the doverai and proverai, trust but verify. And they came to this unique agreement, which lasted for 32 years, longer than the ABM treaty by 2 years, okay? And what happened then? Well, who was it that got out of that? John Bolton told Trump, we don't need that treaty. And Trump said, oh, okay. And Trump was responsible for that. So he can make good on this. I rather think he'll pick the Russians up on that. And that will be a tangible, maybe that will be more persuasive to you, John. But just to finish up here, I want to ask you, are you predicting an Oreshnik moment, let's say within the next week? It's been 10 days, the next week or next month, or are you kind of relenting on that and saying, well, the Russians, as I say, have already made their strategic decision. They're not going to have an Oreshnik moment. They have a hastening and an intensification of the drone strikes and missile strikes on Ukraine, which was happening before all this, but they're not going to have. Do you expect an Oreshnik moment or not?
Well, I think I've explained the Russian position is to wait. And
how long?
Well, let's put it this way. President Trump has broken just about every constitutional or legal barrier to send in 4,000, 5,000 troops into Los Angeles. By Thursday, which the judges in federal court in California has given him, to announce that he's used force to prevent the invasion, the insurrection, and the rebellion in Los Angeles, a complete fabrication. But he will declare victory and then pull the forces out, possibly before the judge issues an injunction. All of that tells a normal American like me or you that Trump's instincts are violence, bluff, until he meets something stronger, and then he withdraws, retreats, which he's just done in London with the Chinese. Now, the testing of Trump his capacity, his violent nature. You don't have to look beyond the tweets or beyond Los Angeles. What he's done there is a threat of violence to provoke, yes, to crush, yes, to announce he's won a victory and to achieve a political victory, which is essentially what he's doing in attacking the front runner of the Democratic Party for incoming election period. So all of this is political, and all of this is understood politically on the Russian side. Now, as far as strategic stability goes, yes, Ray's right. Strategic instability is created for Russia by any attempt Trump makes with Merz to install nuclear-capable weapons in Germany or fire Taurus missiles into Russia. But that's not the only nuclear destabilizing element that Trump's introduced. We are not forgetting, we mentioned it last time, the Golden Dome. The Golden Dome was mentioned not as another pinprick in space, not another smokescreen. The new Russian ambassador to the United States, Mr. Dachiev, has just said, and I'll read it out, the development of the Golden Dome missile defense system delays the launch of a dialogue between the Russian Federation and the United States on strategic stability. Now, what does that mean? It means exactly what he said. We can't talk about strategic stability with Trump if he's insisting on developing the Golden Dome. We can talk about whether he wants to pull back on that destabilizing element, nuclear warfare in space. He might or he might not. We'll wait and see. We're not going to fire anything into space to test him. But the reason I say that one should not be cherry picking Russian statements is because, as I see it, they're all consistent. They're all consistent, not on saying we're about to fire an Oreshnik unless you, Donald Trump, agree to the terms we've tabled in Istanbul. What we're willing to do is to give you at least until the end of the month, when the next round of Istanbul negotiations take place, to see if you will push the Ukrainian regime to the terms we've spelled out. Will you push to have the NATO allies agree to those terms or not? And it's a testing process. I don't mind it, Ray, if you want to test me. I can cope with that. But we're talking here, as you said, Ray, correctly, we're talking about facts. I remember Daniel Patrick Moynihan. I always thought he was an utter blowhard at Harvard, and he was an utter blowhard as senator for New York. And I can hardly imagine anything that he said that deserves to be remembered favorably, but we can cherry pick because we shouldn't speak ill of such a nice Irishman representing the state of New York. The point's different here. What we're trying to do is subject the facts to the same test that normal, clever politicians in Europe, all over Europe, they're not brain dead. They're clever. We don't like them. We don't agree with them. They're all minority rulers in their countries. The disapproval ratings for Starmer, Macron are huge, much bigger than the disapproval rating for Trump. But we're looking to test the facts against time and against the threat of nuclear war. Now, I don't believe that Ms. Gabbard's statement means anything more than an advertisement for a good outcome. And that's good. it's very much better that she would be saying that than her predecessors who spent their time creating the basis for war with Russia. So it's an improvement. I'm not disagreeing with that. What our job is now is in the reality of what does Trump actually mean to do for his political benefit? What does he mean to do for the sequencing of wars from the Ukrainian battlefield to the Northern Front and across to China and so on? And does he mean to do what he so clearly was enthusiastic about when he had Merz in the Oval Office? Or does he mean to do something like he means to do to Gavin Newsom in Los Angeles? They've all got a purpose for him. But if you're the adversary, you've got to test how far he'll go and where his bluff will run out and when he'll walk away. And force is the test. So Russia advances slowly westward, but if by the end of the month there is no movement by Trump on all of the issues involved in the Russian memorandum, then the conclusion will be on the battlefield here, strategic stability in space, strategic stability in the nuclear rearmament of Germany. Those things, Trump can't be believed, can't be trusted.
So
Therefore, then there has to be a Russian response. What exactly that will be, far be it, if I knew it, I wouldn't be telegraphing it, because I'd be telegraphing exactly what we've all said. We want to believe you, President of the United States. We hope you'll be sincere, President of the United States. Frankly, and this is why I keep mentioning it, I think the display in Los Angeles this week is a very good example of how Trump thinks, how he regards force, how the extent to which he will honor not treaty commitments, laws, and the Constitution of the United States. If he disregards them all for a political benefit, and he'll gather a political benefit against Newsom, I don't doubt about that. If from his point of view, he'll declare victory, pull the forces out, and confirm that Governor Newsom won't be able to run effectively against Trump or his candidate, first in the midterms and then in the next presidential election. That's the game. It's very understandable. Intelligent people are spending lots of money and brains on it. But the issue isn't what a nice guy.
John,
Sorry.
here is what Ray pointed out when he talked about that Russia considers the British government in what has happened in Russia. Lavrov said the British are fully involved in Ukraine's terrorist attacks against Russia. He's not talking about the past. He's talking about the British are involved. And
he said 100%. He said U.S. intelligence services, I'm quoting, the U.S. intelligence services are still involved, but the British are involved 100%. Glad to see you back, Ray. Is everything all right over there?
Yes, I had to take care of my wife for a second. She's okay. Mm-hmm.
Good.
Ray.
All right.
Go ahead, Ray.
You go ahead, Ray. You had plenty to say before.
Is it my turn?
Yeah.
Yeah.
I made some notes here. Unpredictable, mercurial, not very observant of our Constitution. Yeah, all adjectives apply to Trump. From Putin's point of view, that really makes it hard, but he's the president. He's the only one that makes any sense in terms of wanting to improve with relations with us. He's the only guy we have to deal with for the next 3+ years, okay? So we're going to deal, see what kind of break we could get. Now, approval rates, that you mentioned approval rates, that those clowns in Europe who don't have very good approval rates. You know, when people say, "Oh, Putin's under great pressure to move more quickly," pressure which he has explicitly acknowledged in a speech about 6 weeks ago when he said, "A lot of people want me to go much faster in Ukraine, but we're doing just fine, please. We're doing just fine." Now, he seems pretty confident. When Putin's approval rate goes from 82% now, according to the latest polls, down to, I would say 65%, then I'll believe that people opposing his course of action have some heft in Russia. He has been
Ray, by the way,
Yeah.
yesterday the head of German intelligence approved that. He said he said that the support to Russian President Vladimir Putin is more than 80%. That
Okay, so these are recent polls. Now, my point is,
No, the
that-
polls are stable, Ray. The polls of approval for President Putin are stable at over 80%, and they're
yeah,
stable
well, that's
for
what
the
I'm
Russian
saying.
army.
So what I'm saying, John, is when they go below that, then I'll give some credence to the fact that he has to respond to these Russians that want him to go faster or want to have a Oreshnik moment. Now, there was a poll published in Newsweek 2 days ago. It's John, you'll appreciate this. Remember the Glavny Vrag, the main enemy? It used to be the Soviet Union and Russia. It used to be, from their perspective, the United States. Guess what? The recent polls show that the Glavny Vrag, the main enemy of Russia, is no longer the United States. It's gone down from, I think, 67% for the United States down to something like 40 during Trump's regime. Now, what does that mean? Wow. Who is the Glavny Vrag? Germany, Ukraine. So there's been a sea change in the way the Russians look at things, according to Levada, which is a reasonable
Yes,
reputation. And so what I'm saying here is Putin seems to be completely in charge. He's playing a mellow kind of wait and see game. We're not going to be forced into any Oreshnik moment, not now and not 4 weeks from now, John. I'm going to hold you to that. Okay. What else did I want to say? Oh, yeah. Well, there's another little fact here, not opinion, but fact. Bone crushing sanctions. Lindsey Graham and 80 senators, veto proof. BS. Not veto proof. As soon as Trump tells them, look, if you're going to pass that legislation, make sure that it's all ad referendum me. In other words, let's make sure that the text says that the president has to approve these bone crunching sanctions. That would be good. That would be a lever I have, but that would give me the ability to not approve them. Or I'll veto them. And you think you have 80 senators? You just wait. Now, that has already happened over the last week. Bone-crushing sanctions are off the table unless they're watered down to give the president the ability to nix them, to veto them, or the ability just to say, well, no, the legislation says I can nix them and I will. So we have lots of real facts here. We have even more real opinions. And in defense of my Irish compatriot here, Daniel Patrick Moynihan, who was a blowhard, every now and then a blowhard says something sensible. And this quote from him, which is kind of a proverbial quote, is everyone's entitled to their own opinions, but they are not entitled to their own facts. And there have been a lot of facts manufactured here or predictions made on the assumption that the Russians have said this or that, whereas the real story is they haven't said any of that.
Let's go. Fair enough. Enough of Daniel Patrick Moynihan. Let me go to the Levada opinion poll because it was just done. It's a relatively independent Russian polling outfit in Moscow, and it's condemned by the government as as being influenced by foreign agents who supply money. The sociology of Levada is stable and pretty good. What it actually found was, yes, Russian public opinion was persuaded by Russian state views that President Trump offered an opportunity for a peaceful outcome in the Ukraine, which the Biden administration did not. That's correct. But the Levada poll shows, both by national polling and by interviews and by focus groups, that Russian public opinion will follow officials who say, Trump's offering an opportunity, let's give him a chance. And I'll just read you the conclusion of the Levada poll that Denis Volkov, a good Russian sociologist, wrote on Monday. Quotes, if a negative scenario is implemented as a result of the failure of negotiations with Kiev and the failure of rapprochement with Washington, then, says Volkov, about Russian public opinion on the point, by analogy with the situation after the offensive of Ukrainian forces in Kursk, we can expect a decrease in the share of supporters of the transition to negotiations. However, the effect is unlikely to be sharp and long-term. In many ways, the depth of the decline, support for negotiations rather than, let's call it the Oreshnik moment, finishing them off. The depth of this decline will be determined by the rhetoric of the Russian authorities. In other words, the Russian public opinion is being guided, and the official view is test Trump to see how violent, how certain, how persuasive, how committed he'll be to the Russian terms. By the end of this month, negotiations with Kiev will either succeed or fail on Trump. If they don't, we'll see how much more time Russian leadership will give Trump to deliver. If he doesn't deliver, the entire public opinion will be different. But it's not public opinion that directs military operations. Russian public opinion accepts and trusts the Russian army more than any other institution in the country, including the president and including the church. It's the general staff which has taken the view that as Lavrov explained, American advisors remain guiding strategic, operational, and tactical operations in Kiev. They also participate in operating the weapon systems supplied by the United States and so forth and so on. Lavrov was very clear about that on Monday. So we're not letting anyone off the hook. We're trying, Russia's trying, to provide a platform in which Trump can prove himself one way or the other. Peacemaker, like Tulsi Gabbard says, or war maker, like Governor of California says. That's the test now.
Yeah, I just would comment real quickly that you and I know, John, but maybe not other people who are familiar with Kremlin terminology. Since the revolution, I mean, the Glavny Vrag, the main enemy, has been the United States. So there's no diminishing the importance of the fact that the latest polls have decidedly rejected that. It's not the United States anymore, it's Germany, my God. And as you can imagine, Russians feel rather strongly about the Germans, next the Ukrainians. So all you say may be true. It is true, but it doesn't really matter. The main point I was trying to make is this is a big sea change, and I read it in Newsweek, for God's sake.
Thank you so much, John and Ray, for being with us today. Great pleasure as always. And it's so beautiful to see the differences so obvious and vivid for us. Yeah.
Well, thank you, Nima, and thank you, John.
Thank you, Ray. Thank you, Nima.
See you soon.